Do you have a secret? Everybody has a secret. There is no doubt in my mind that the Apostle Paul was a craftsman of the written word. As a missionary, the legacy of churches that he left behind all around Asia were a testimony of his organizational skills and leadership ability. As a preacher, Paul never filled the prestigious pulpits of his day, but he preached everywhere he could go. He preached by the riverside, he preached in the synagogue, he preached in the marketplace, and he preached in a prison cell. As a man of charisma and charm, he was by no means an impressive figure. And yet for all that Paul was, and for all that Paul was not, there is no doubt in my mind that the Apostle Paul was a craftsman of the written word. Paul's letter to the church that be at Rome, which was transported on the stamp, on the Corinthian stamp, postage stamp, is the finest example of Paul's ability as a communicator of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You do know, however, that Paul would have attained his writing skills while matriculating in the Hebrew schools in Jerusalem, and then while a student at the feet of Gamaliel. You see, Paul was no ordinary, run-of-the-mill preacher. Paul was a rabbi of rabbis, a scholar's scholar, and a preacher's preacher. Paul's every word reflects the cultural climate of his time and the unmistakable birthright of his breeding. But above all else, Paul's writing is reflective of the fact that somewhere in this life, he did have an intimate encounter with the eternal. And I do declare that there is no doubt in my mind that the Apostle Paul was a craftsman of the written word. How else does one account for the genius in his writing? How else does one account for this ancient day wordsmith who used poetry in his prose and wrote prose as though it were poetry? Who else but Paul could write a word of judgment on the misuse of spiritual gifts and at the same time a self-analysis of his own preaching? Said Paul, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Who else but Paul could write a word that would summon troops to battle and yet write a word in step with the music that was in his own soul? Said Paul, if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself for the battle? Who else but Paul could write with such sensitivity to the human predicament that even when he speaks of the sunshine and the shadows in his own life, every word has the authentic ring of someone who has borne the burden in the heat of the day? Said Paul, I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know how to abound, and I know how to be abased. I know that everywhere in all things I'm instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. And then it says in verse 13, I can do all things through Christ, who is my strength. Who else but Paul could write in the middle of a storm-tossed sea, or in the loneliness of a cold and dark and dank and damp prison cell? Who else but Paul could write with such vividness of expression that we could almost see him thrown from his horse on that Damascus road? Who else but Paul could write with such a flair for the descriptive that we can feel every rock and jolt of that earthquake down in Philippi when Silas sang and Paul prayed. And all of this formed the basis of my insistence that I have no doubt in my mind that the Apostle Paul was a craftsman, a master craftsman of the written word. I've raised the issue of Paul's incomparable writing style because every student of Pauline thought will be interested in what Paul says, but more interested in how Paul said it. And there in the 2nd chapter of the letter that Paul wrote to the Christians that be in Rome, Paul has dealt with the uncomfortable matter of sin and judgment. And Paul has barely moved into the substance of the epistle when he gives a rather lengthy description or list of those whose sins and shortcomings are an equal par. As Paul says, that God had given them up to a reprobate mind to do those things that are not convenient. But to be fair to Paul, you need to understand that the purpose of what may be an unfair diatribe by a preacher whose credentials were questioned in some quarters, Paul raises these issues first and foremost in the 1st and 2nd chapters, not as a means of pointing out the faults of one group over another. Because essentially, there is no difference in sin. We are all God's children. And because we are all God's children, there's no such thing as Jewish sin and Gentile sin. Because we are all God's children, there's no such thing as male sin and female sin. Because we are all God's children, there's no such thing as homosexual sin or heterosexual sin. Because we are all God's children, there's no such thing as Kiwi sin. Hello? Or Tongan sin, or Fijian sin, or Samoan sin, or Chinese sin, or Estonian sin, or European sin, or indeed South African sin. Paul says that sin is sin, and that God is no respecter of persons. However, in the midst of his writing, Paul places a parenthesis. And this is the only place in the whole Pauline corpus where I have come across a parenthesis. What do we call it? Brackets. Brackets. A parenthesis. A parenthesis is a sentence within a sentence. A thought within a thought, a necessary digression in the mind of the author. A parenthesis is used grammatically to indicate a break in the thought of the writer with a matter which demands the immediate and the urgent attention of the reader. A parenthetical thought is an unavoidable interruption along the path of a logical journey with an idea of concept that cannot wait for another moment for expression. A parenthesis. Now this may sound boring, but it has to do with you and with me. So just hold on. A parenthesis sets a new idea apart from the whole and says, take note, pay attention, you better listen because what I'm going to say now is important to you. And at the risk of sounding repetitive to those who were here last week, you must understand that Paul wrote these words while he was writing as a Hebrew, a Jewish rabbi, and he was writing to a community that was dominated by those who were Jewish by birth and now found themselves in close contact with Gentiles. I said this has to do with you. Some of you are South African by birth. And when you came to this country, you found yourself in close contact with Kiwis. Was it fun? Yes, it was. Some of you are Samoan by birth. When you came to this country, you found yourself in close contact with Trinidadians. Was it fun? Or was it fun? Some of you are British by birth and you came here, you came in close contact with Fijians. Was it fun? Or was it fun? Some of you are Filipino by birth, and when you came here, you found yourself in close contact with Zimbabweans. Was it fun? Or was it fun? And so you can place yourself right here in the story, in Paul's parenthetical thought, if you wish. No, you see, these Jews found themselves in contact with Gentiles, and they became a little uncomfortable. You see, Jews did not deal with Gentiles. After all, Jews were saved, and Gentiles were not. Jews did not deal with Gentiles. After all, Jews were the chosen people, the recipients of the law. Gentiles were not. Jews did not deal with Gentiles because Jews were direct descendants of Abraham, and Gentiles were not. Jews did not deal with Gentiles because Jews were going to heaven, and the Gentiles were not. Does it sound familiar? And as a result of this rather narrow elitist thought pattern among the Jews, Paul's objective was quite pure and quite simple. Jews who knew the law would be judged by the law, Paul says. Gentiles who did not know the law would be judged as ones who did not know the law. Although very often Paul says Gentiles behaved as though they knew the law, and Jews behaved as though they had never heard the law. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound familiar? And Paul suggested that both Jews and Gentiles, they knew the difference between right and wrong, and neither could expect exemption before God. And this is the reason for Paul's parenthesis. Says Paul, while I'm dealing with this matter of the nature of sin, while I'm trying to define sin and how God deals with sin, maybe I'd better tell you a few things parenthetically. And so Paul says the first thing is that we must have a right relationship with God. The mark of authentic religion is not whether you're a hand-clapping, foot-patting believer. The marks of authentic Christianity is not whether you're a Bible-toting, scripture-quoting believer, but it is that we should not only talk the talk, but we should walk the walk. In fact, we should walk the talk. We should walk the talk. This is what Paul is talking about. It's just a parenthesis, but Mr. and Mrs. every Sabbath churchgoer ought to know that it's not what you do when you're in here, but what you do when you go out there that really counts. It's just a parenthesis, but Mr. and Mrs. joyful hymn and praise song singers all over the congregation ought to be reminded that it's not the song we sing with our lips, but the songs we shout with our lives that matter. It's just a parenthesis, but the pastor, long-winded preacher ought to remember that real preaching has no power until you practice what you preach. And that is just what Paul meant to say when he added this parenthetical comment. Paul says, if you brought the word of God with you,